What I'm going to talk about today is developing a law school class. And if you could change the slide, the first thing I'm going to do is just to determine from the audience whether or not your state already has a law school class, and if so, what kind. So I'm launching a poll. Some law schools have externship programs where they place people in your office, much like what Nell is talking about. But what I'm going to be focusing on is a prosecutor policy class in your law school. Okay, so thank you to those of you who voted. I'm going to show the results of the poll now. So we can see that of the people who voted, there are 34% said that there are no prosecutor classes in their law school. That's pretty extraordinary. 73% said that they had externship programs with their law school. That's terrific. 32% said that they had a trial advocacy class, which is pretty typical. And I think Nell is teaching one of those. She mentioned it. But only 14% have a prosecutor policy class. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. So if we could just get to the next slide. So if you are inclined to create a class like this, and I strongly encourage it because it really is very satisfying for senior prosecutors, as many people are on this call. So step number one is to find a contact at the law school. And this has many benefits. We heard from Nell how important it is to create a connection with your career office at your local law school. You also can do that through interns, your internship program. But these people, these connections that you have because of internship programs, or just maybe it's your neighbor, it doesn't matter how you have that contact at the law school, but you need an in. So you can go to the law school and say, I would like to teach a class on prosecutor policy, and I can do it as an adjunct professor. This does not have to be anything that's expensive for the law school. We all know, if any of you who does adjunct teaching, they pay you a pittance, so it's not particularly expensive for the law school. What you can pitch to the law school is a couple of things. Number one, it's an opportunity for the students to be exposed to other kinds of job possibilities, number one. And number two, the law school should be balanced, because many law schools do have defense clinics or defense-oriented classes, all of which are great. But I do think that law school should be balanced in what they expose their students to. So I found that when you mention job possibilities, balance, ease of creating the class, you may get a positive reception. Next slide. You could just turn to the next slide. If you do get a positive reaction, and you may want to think about this before you go to your law school, you should think a little bit about what format you would want the class to be. Now, are you trying to teach a lecture program where you're just sitting in front of a bunch of students who are listening to lectures? That is less likely to be the type of class that I'm talking about, but if someone's willing to take that on, great. It's more likely to be a seminar or a practicum, a small class of maybe 10, 15, 20 students where they can sit and discuss with you, with the speakers and amongst themselves, the very, very interesting criminal justice issues of the day. Another issue you may want to think about is, do you want these students to be writing a paper? Do you want them to take exams? So as to writing papers, that can be very helpful. Some have used their classes to help do legal research on pending issues in the office, not necessarily on a specific case, but on a general issue of interest to the office. In my class, I pick various topics that I think PCE would want to distribute to the general prosecutor population. And many of the articles that I have worked on through the years have been with the help of students doing this kind of work. And we know that criminal justice issues are hot. So there are many different types of topics that you can write about. And we're going to talk about some of the topics that we discuss. You may also want to think about, do I want to have an exam? Classes usually end with an exam. One of my former colleagues who teaches a class like this in Colorado gave me a fabulous idea, which I use to this day at Georgetown, which is that our students do write papers, but we do not have an exam. Instead, at the end of the class, the students give a TED Talk, a 15-minute, half an hour oral presentation to the rest of the class, highlighting what they wrote in their paper. And so it provides oral advocacy. The teacher can listen to the TED Talk. We can see how good that TED Talk is. And the beauty of it is, for an adjunct professor, is you're not grading exams. So this has turned out to be very helpful, but these are sort of practical things that you should be thinking about as you approach the law school about what kind of class and the structure of the class that you want to teach. Next slide, please. So once you sort of figured out the general structure, and let us assume that you've decided to do it as a seminar, you then should start developing a syllabus, getting a teacher, and seeing if you want guest speakers. Now, getting a teacher may be sort of the most important part of this. So in my particular class, I teach it with a colleague, a woman in the U.S. Attorney's Office in DC. And it's very helpful to have two of us because we're both busy, and it's not always guaranteed that I can be at every class given my travel schedule. And it's nice to have a second teacher there to back you up. Another model is to find a teacher who is already teaching criminal law in the law school. That teacher, and it's often someone who was a prosecutor in the past, may be interested in having a class if they can get assistance from guest speakers on a lot of the topics. So you can either come in as an adjunct yourself or work in partnership with an existing teacher who is at the law school. So once you have someone who's going to be the anchor, which would be the teacher, then you can decide what you want to do in your syllabus. And because this is not a trial advocacy course, this is a policy course, you can start to think about what are the issues of the day that you want the students to hear about, and how do you convey to them the prosecutor's perspective on these issues? Because so many of the criminal justice issues of the day are complex and nuanced. Just for example, no cash bail. What does no cash bail mean? That's very easy to say, but there are all kinds of ramifications and issues that can be discussed. So it's just an example of the types of things that can be a part of a syllabus. Inviting guest speakers is a wonderful thing for a teacher because, of course, you then don't have to write every class, and you get to invite other really experienced people to come in and teach the class. And this is an area where people just, in my experience at least, have tremendously enjoyed coming in to teach the class. Most of these classes that are like seminars tend to be 2 hours long. And what you can do is, you know, the experts on various topics in your jurisdiction. You know who's a good speaker. You know who might have done something that's really interesting. And you bring them in for your class to give a presentation, to have a conversation with the students. And it's tremendously valuable to the students and a lot of fun for the guest speakers. I know anytime I've asked someone to be a guest speaker, they always want to come back because they enjoy it. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to show some syllabuses. I'm just going to show two to give you a feel for how you can do this. So this is the syllabus we use at Georgetown Law School. And you can see the first class is an introductory class. We then bring in an elected prosecutor to talk about what it means to be the chief prosecutor and prosecutorial discretion and, you know, just what it's like to run an office. So they meet a real life chief prosecutor. And we've changed this up, but this is just an example of what we're going to be doing this year. Then we're going to bring in a sex crime prosecutor who, and we've done this before, has a very interesting sample case where he kind of rolls out the facts slowly and asks the students, what would you do if you knew this fact and that fact? And they learn to see how you have to assess a case. And it's very interesting and also raises issues about how to address victims and witnesses. We're lucky enough to have a police officer or commanding officer of the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. He's come in to talk about, one year he spoke about what it's like to get body-worn cameras on police officers and how they reacted to that. Another year he talked about the protests and how they dealt with it and what the issues were there. We have a class on prosecutorial ethics with many hypotheticals. It's not just law, but it's hypotheticals. And in fact, I've lectured on some of these hypotheticals. I was just in Nevada doing an ethics class with hypotheticals where I asked the audience what the answer was. It could be very interesting. Then we talk about preventing wrongful convictions. We are going to have a presentation on homicide prosecution and digital evidence. We all know that digital evidence is a growing part of our work, and to have a discussion about privacy, surveillance, preservation, finding it, all those things, extremely interesting. We've always had a presenter on forensics. Many issues come up now with low copy DNA, ballistics, NIBIN, how to collect all of this. Now suddenly prosecutors who are lawyers have to understand the science. We've had very experienced forensic people come in. Building community trust. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture in a second. We had a presentation from the director of community outreach at the Delaware Attorney General's office. That's their prosecution arm in Delaware. And one of the people who works there is a formerly incarcerated person, wonderful, wonderful man who came in and spoke about his experience, how he's now working in a prosecutor's office, explaining how the role of a prosecutor's office has expanded so tremendously into this kind of community outreach. We're going to have someone from Maine Justice come and talk about how Maine Justice makes their policy decisions that impacts the future prosecution. And then finally, we have a prosecutor, very, very experienced gang prosecutor, African-American gang prosecutor, who can talk about that, but also has developed race and equity committee within his own office, and to talk about what it's like from his experience being a prosecutor. So that's just a sampling of the types of topics that can generate, as you can imagine, lots of discussion with law students. Next slide, please. So here, this is our class with the Delaware Attorney General's office. Next slide. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly. This slide also shows all the topics. I'm not going to go through them because of time, but you can see this was the Pace Law School class. What's interesting about the Pace Law School class is we intentionally there brought in people from different prosecutor offices from around the state, so that the students could meet prosecutors in different offices and have a contact, so that all these offices have the opportunity to potentially hire some of these students. So from different parts of New York. This is a New York law school. Next slide, please. Other states have done this as well. In Virginia, the Virginia Prosecutors Association put together a class at Richmond Law School. The way they do it is the students in that class go to the Virginia Prosecuting Association summer conference and present to all the DAs what they've researched. In Michigan, they have a class similar to what I've mentioned. North Carolina, they have a mixture of trial advocacy and policy. In Colorado, they have one that's policy oriented, quite like what I've described already. And I'm sure there are others, but it is not that hard to do. Next slide, please. So that's the quick overview. And I really encourage it. My students have stayed in touch with me for years, and many have become prosecutors. And if nothing else, as Nell mentioned, we're getting the word out that prosecution is very broad, evolving, and there to serve the communities that they are elected to serve, not just in public safety, but in so many other ways.